Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the most anticipated games of the last 10 years, but it was completely broken as shit at launch. Since then, 2 class action lawsuits have been filed against the developer, accusing them of straight up lying to investors and knowingly launching a game that was literally unplayable for a lot of people on console. Alright, so here's where I tell you to scroll down and hit that subscribe button. So, go ahead and do that. While you're at it, hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. The launch of Cyberpunk 2077 was among the worst we've ever seen, especially given the hype. No other game in recent memory has gone from potential game of a generation to flaming disaster quite like it has. And because of their awful launch, developer CD Projekt Red is now facing 2 class action lawsuits, which accuse them of lying to investors about the broken state of the game, as well as blaming them for all of the problems that happened post-launch. You guys also might remember that the game was so broken at launch that Sony, Microsoft, and Best Buy not only offered refunds on the game, Sony fucking pulled it from the entirety of its digital store. On top of that, we recently got the first of 2 gigantic patches intended to, and when I say this, I'm only being slightly hyperbolic, fix the entire game. And wouldn't you know it, players are reporting a new game-breaking bug because of these patches. Alright, so let's start from the beginning. Cyberpunk 2077 was announced in 2012, and it was confirmed that CD Projekt Red would be developing it. The entire gaming world spent the next 8 years losing their fucking minds. Every piece of concept art, every trailer, every chunk of gameplay drooled over by eager fans wanting to get their hands on this thing. And to a certain extent, you can't blame them. This was the follow-up to The Witcher 3, widely considered one of the best games ever made. And at that time, CD Projekt Red could do no wrong. Hell, in 2019, they even pledged to get rid of crunch. That kind of forced overtime that's just unfortunately a fact of life in video game development. It's something that they were known for in the past, and it's something that they wanted to fix. Unfortunately, the entirety of that CDPR can do no wrong sentiment disappeared in 2020. By then, Cyberpunk 2077 was in late-stage development and anticipation was through the roof. But from January up until its eventual release in December, that anticipation was met with growing concern. Here's just some of the stuff that led people to believe that Cyberpunk might not be the perfect game we were hoping for. For one thing, there was 3 separate delays. And then there was the revelation that forced overtime hours would be necessary when they publicly said it wouldn't be. And finally, there was the overly sexualized marketing that feels like it came from the mind of a horny 8th grader. There's plenty more, but we don't have all day. Now, for most of you watching, you know what crunch or being forced to work a ton of overtime hours is, and I don't think you'll be surprised when I describe it as honestly a terrible and inhumane practice.
I worked about 7 days a week, between 14 and 16-hour days.
And when would you go home?
I would go home when I was ready to collapse, basically.
And we're not talking about working overtime for a week or 2 at a time here. According to a report from Bloomberg published in September, not only were mandatory 6-day work weeks being enforced, some developers on staff had been working extra overtime for more than a year. And well, it turns out that those growing concerns were justified, because when Cyberpunk launched on December 10th, it was an unmitigated disaster, especially on console. Just look at some of this shit.
You're certified bug-free. Bug-free.
Shit, Victor, not bad. I don't know what to say.
Say you'll take this and remember the dosage. 2 whips now, and another 2 in an hour.
And while those clips are hilarious, it's like, how could you think this game was ever ready for launch looking at this stuff? And on top of all that, the game was literally unplayable for some people. And when I say some people, again, we're talking about enough people for Sony, Microsoft, and even goddamn Best Buy to start offering refunds on the game. And the fact that Sony pulled the game from its digital storefront, now that is unheard of. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the launch, CDPR's stock plummeted 29%. We're talking about $1.8 billion wiped out. And it's here where we loop all the way back around to those two class action lawsuits that I mentioned off the top. Essentially, both lawsuits accuse CDPR of lying to investors and the general public about the broken state of the game prior to its launch. And due to those alleged lies, a broken game was sold to the public that cost investors a ton of money. And these lawsuits are basically trying to recoup a piece of that money for its investors, as well as getting CDPR to pay legal fees. Here's two examples of statements that the lawsuit alleges were either lies or full of bias. And just for context, these statements were made by CDPR management to investors during different conference calls. Quote, "I wouldn't say that there's a problem because there's nothing wrong with the Xbox or PS4 versions. There is optimization to be handled, also because of how we were approaching things from the get-go in terms of development, so there is no problem with Xbox or PlayStation 4, to be honest." End quote. The lawsuits then cite another call after the release of the game, once it was abundantly clear that Cyberpunk was not ready for launch, and here's what CDPR management had to say then. Quote, "After 3 delays, we as the management board were too focused on releasing the game. We underestimated the scale and complexity of the issues. We ignored the signals about the need for additional time to refine the game on base last-gen consoles. It was the wrong approach and against our business philosophy. On top of that, during the campaign, we showed the game mostly on PCs." End quote. From there, the lawsuit alleges that by making these false or misleading statements, CDPR violated various sections of the Exchange Act. And the Exchange Act basically encompasses all of the rules, laws, and regulations around buying and selling stocks in the United States. Quote, "Because of their positions of control and authority as senior officers, the individual defendants were able to, and did, control the contents of the various reports, press releases, and public filings which the company disseminated in the marketplace during the class period. Throughout the class period, the individual defendants exercised their power and authority to cause the company to engage in the wrongful acts complained of herein." End quote. What the lawsuit is saying here is that senior management at CDPR had control and final say over messaging and marketing around the game, and either lied, misrepresented, or straight up just didn't tell anybody that the game was busted. And remember, because CDPR management allegedly lied about the state of the game, investors lost $1.8 billion. You'd expect people to be pretty heated. And then finally, the lawsuits ask that CDPR pay for damages and court fees, and then demand a jury trial. And while both these lawsuits read as two gigantic "this you" Twitter threads, it'll be interesting to see what impact, if any, these court cases have on the games industry as a whole. And as if that wasn't enough, CDPR are breaking their game in new ways while trying to fix it. They recently announced 2 gigantic patches they hoped would fix everything, but instead, it just introduced a new game-breaking bug. Essentially what's happening is that dialogue that's supposed to trigger and move a quest forward doesn't happen, and then you're stuck. This was enough of a reoccurring problem that on January 23rd, CDPR put out a statement basically saying, "Hey, here's a workaround, just load in a different save." Which is truly what you don't want to see. So really, it turns out that Cyberpunk 2077 is not the boundary-pushing, revolutionary video game people wanted or thought it was going to be. It's a pretty ordinary, even fun game with a ton of ordinary and industry-specific problems that have been around for decades at this point. And honestly, that's all it was ever going to be. I'm trying, man, alright? I'm trying. I can't! We're in the middle of a lockdown! I know there is. And the funny thing about all this, I look like an insane person because nobody can hear what you're saying to me. I'm not grumpy at you or at any person. Well, we have our end board.
Well,
That hurt my head.